delighted in this episode to be joined by David Bliss. David and I have worked together for a good 10 years on lots of corporate work, particularly around presenting and executive presence and those types of topics. David has spent some years in advertising before he trained as an actor, and I know from many conversations we've had, he is deeply fascinated about really what it is that creates great storytellers, great presenters, great orators, great communicators. Why is it one person manages to hold an audience over another? And I think we both concluded that storytelling is one of the key features of that. And this is something that David has some deep experience and knowledge of. There is no question at all that stories, more than any other form of communication, have the ability to deeply engage an audience. And if your task is to get a message across, there's no better form than storytelling to get traction on those ideas. So David, thank you. Thank you for joining me today. Welcome to the Power Up Podcast.
Absolutely my pleasure. Yeah, we have worked together for quite a few years, so it's just fun to do this and to talk about story. I spend an awful lot of time working with people and their stories.
Perhaps you could start there, actually. What is the kind of... I know we do kind of corporate work together where, particularly around our programs around helping people win work and pitching. What is the sort of the bulk of the work you do with executives and clients?
Well, it can vary. A lot of it is at that executive level where you're reaching a level where your stories become more important than what you actually do. So this story of your organization, of you, how it works, the stories and the culture that you are in become incredibly important. And being able to actually tell those stories, to be able to get people to understand what are the things that organization's gone through or you've gone through to get where you've got. It's taking really people from the idea of anecdote to story. Lots of people have anecdotes. Lots of people have anecdotes of what have happened in their life, but a story is predominantly about a shift. So where you start is not where you end. There's almost an opposite. Where you start, where you were once lost, then you are found. There's a sense that is a complete arc that has happened. That's a story. A lot of people will come to me initially with anecdotes and I'll say they're great, they're funny.
And what do you see as a difference with an anecdote?
An anecdote is a story that you might tell your friends in a pub. It might be something that happened recently, and there won't be any massive shift or change for you or the person listening to it. A story, there is a reflection in terms of the journey that you went through and your change, but also your reflection in that story is, what does that mean to me? Would I have done that? Or that's made me really think about doing things differently. That story. And that's the bit that makes us have a sense of the world and how it works or how we think it works. Story allows us to make sense of our world and how we inhabit it. And I think that's the key thing. Anecdotes are fun or interesting, but they don't shift you.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. So in the corporate world, is that where you see where the real... I mean, obviously stories have lots of applications in many, many settings. We're specifically, I guess, talking to an audience is primarily in the corporate world. So what's the real significance of using stories in the corporate world?
It's interesting. I'm asked this a lot in terms of the difference between what we consider story to be in a environment of film, novels, stories that we exchange to the corporate understanding. There isn't really any difference. In the corporate world, we are tied into what this may mean in terms of the journey of the organization, whether it's growth or things they have to do. But really fundamentally, the core to any good story is what's the emotional impact of that story. So even if it's about the growth of an organization, whether it becomes a global growth, whatever it might be, or the challenges that they face, we have to understand why. There has to be the emotional content of what this means. And that's what you're getting people to really tie into, is to understand. We talk about corporate and non-corporate, but actually story. You know, we'll all sit and watch a box set and we'll all know which are the great ones. That's because the stories are so strong.
So what are the real roots of storytelling. I've often heard it described as it's hardwired into your DNA. For anyone listening to this who's would possibly, oh yes, I know some really great storytellers, and they almost preclude themselves from being good at it, almost like it's the domain of somebody who perhaps, like yourself, who's been in acting, has been professionally trained, or is just a natural gifted storyteller. So I'm curious, first of all, as to why does it, almost at a primitive level, seem to impact the brain in the way that it does?
Well, I think because the way we've understood how we survive has been through story. We need story to understand what is frightening, what is safe, what is not safe. It is absolutely fundamentally our DNA. We understand that. The stories we tell children, whether it's about tooth fairies or whatever, they're all things to
Giving
help
meaning
us,
to things.
meaning and guiding you through life.
Yeah.
So we are all hardwired to it. We all can be great storytellers. There are technical elements that people need to understand about story. Fundamentally, we can all tell great stories. The hardest thing to do is actually, for an awful lot of people, is to make sure that you are collecting and collating story. Because quite often, and in my environment of working with people maybe who are doing a TED event, you have to really take them through a process where they go back and revisit stories that all come together to help them create that 12, 15-minute TED piece.
And that's by the way, that is some of the work that you do, is helping people prepare for TED Talks.
Yeah, getting them to find the story, getting to understand if that story will work or that story won't work. And that takes a process. That takes a process of filtering. Some people think their best stories often don't turn out to be the best stories to use because they're too close to them. I think one of the key things that I've always told anybody in terms of if you want to develop story is you have to think about what are the stories that happen in your everyday life and then take the time to write them down at some point. I just recently read a really excellent book, and I'll give some books I think are really good to read, but this one is by a guy called Matthew Dix, and why I love this book, it's called Storyworthy. He's not a professional performer, he is a school teacher, and he does these, which I didn't even know existed, called story slams. I now know they exist in the UK as well, but mainly in the States, where people get up and they tell their own authentic stories. And I have to say, this is one of the best books I've ever read on how you find your stories. And the thing about finding stories is you need to exercise your mind to keep creating stories. It doesn't matter if it's a corporate story or it's a personal story. If you exercise that, it's much easier to delve into those stories. So in the corporate environment, it's much quicker to see a story that matters to the organization. You'll recognize it much faster, because for the most part, we live our lives on a day-to-day basis, and something will happen and we may pass it on at the end of the day to our partners. And that's it. But what I love about, and something I've recommended to people for years, but in Storyworthy, what Matthew talks about is this thing called homework for life. And that is for 5 minutes every day, just 5 minutes every day, write in a short form a story that you would pick from your day. Doesn't matter how benign it is, it's just a story, and write it down. And in doing that, and he talks a lot about, in doing that, you slow time down because you've fully experienced your day and you have a record of stories. And it's true, you do. Time slows down. But more importantly, when it comes to preparing an event, and it could be the launch of a product, or it could be to shareholders or in the boardroom, you have a place to go. You can look at those stories and say, well, this is something I can connect with this story, which talks about what we're now doing over the next year or 5 years.
It makes a lot of sense. And I actually do have a little A4 book myself, which I did start. I was so completely followed through. He reminded me of the importance of it. But I do tend to put them on. If I find a little anecdote or I hear a story, I will jot little notes. But I like this idea of being quite intentional about it. And what you're really suggesting is that if you exercise that intention to be a storyteller by getting into the habit of jotting them down, then we encourage people to be a collector of stories.
Yeah.
So you've got this huge sort of catalogue of different ideas or to to innate when you know you've got to get a point across around change or coming back from despair or overcoming difficulty or whatever it might be. You've got something to pull from. Can we just go back a little and talk maybe a little bit about what's kind of brought you to this point where you now spend quite a lot of your time coaching executives on stories? What's the kind of the background from your sort of, your acting and advertising that's led you to this point?
Well, like most things in life, I sort of fell or tumbled into this world. I wouldn't say that I was driven into this world. I think you discover as you get older, lots of avenues that you take you to a place where you suddenly discover you have lots of experience, which...
Because wouldn't it be fair to say, David, most people probably would go, acting, oh shit, this didn't work. Advertising. You've gone from advertising to acting, which is quite a different sort of...
Thanks for that, Martin.
Yeah. Isn't that so true? I mean, about
absolutely
actors. I mean,
right.
know, and the stats around unemployed actors is unbelievable. 90% of them are.
I think the reality is you hit a point in your life as an actor. Mm-hmm. And I pretty much think it's around 30, 35, where you say to yourself, am I being asked for this part because they want me, or am I just filling up? Am I anyone? They could get anyone who's my height, looks like me, and has that. And that was happening to me. I was often playing businessmen, husbands, but they were nondescript. It was not people were saying, the only time I was ever doing that was maybe in theatre. But I think you're right. I think you reach a point, either you are dogged and you are not, and I have friends who have not given up and dogged, some who have become very successful, some who are alcoholics. I mean, there is an extreme to this profession. And I think in my case, you do go, well, actually, whatever happens, I don't want to be defined by being an actor. I do want to do the nice things in life. I'd like to travel. I'd like to, own a home, have children. And that gets harder and harder on a freelance basis. Mm-hmm. So I think I took those elements, especially the elements initially of advertising and acting, where a story is crucial in both. It's crucial in advertising and it's crucial in building a character. So yes, I think I tumbled into a world and it led me to you. I mean, initially what happened was I would be asked as an actor to enter the corporate world where I would play difficult CEOs, difficult people. And that led me into the world of coaching and facilitation. Yeah. But yes, failed actor.
No, I wasn't suggesting that.
I know.
I was saying that people fail at acting, then go into business.
Yes.
And you kind of did it the reverse way round, from advertising into acting. And maybe you can, share some experience of what you learned about storytelling later on as we progress. What do stories do to the brain that if we're passing information from one person to another, we can give people facts and figures and numbers and logical reasoning, etc., etc. Or we can take that information and we can put it into a story.
Yeah.
Why is it that stories are so much stickier, and why do they serve as a good means to transfer your message other than just in a linear, logical form?
Well, I think, as you know, in terms of neuroscience, we now know that story lights up far greater areas within the brain than just factual information.
Yeah.
We know that. We know that has that stimulation for that. Mm-hmm. So we know that there is more of an involvement in terms of hearing a story. But more importantly, story enables us to make sense of any data. Data doesn't mean anything. We can't retain data. It's very hard. And I know when I work with people in terms of important presentations, for example, you can put stats up on a slide and then ask the audience after 2 more slides what that stat was, and they can't tell you.
No.
They will tell you if it's tied into what it means. And that's where story is so important. And also, story doesn't need to be an incredibly long thing. It can be short, but it has to have meaning. It has to have meaning and it has to have resonance. We have to, quite often with great story, we reflect upon what it would also mean to us. Mm-hmm. And that's the key thing. You go, okay, that's interesting. Would I have done that?
I was thinking as you were speaking then, I was thinking, what a relief it is when a speaker, after giving a couple of slides, as you say, of some rich data, says, would it be helpful if I gave you an example? Or let me tell you a story. That I was coaching someone the other day for a talk, an introduction they've got to do. I was listening to him doing the rehearsal, and I was just thinking, this so much needs a story. And then suddenly he comes in with a story, and suddenly everything he was saying, as you said, suddenly started to make sense. You know, my coaching was basically, let's take that story, let's shove it much earlier in the presentation. Let's not leave it too late.
Yeah.
And do you find that when you're coaching people, it's almost like they need permission to tell a story?
I think they do. And I think sometimes there's this idea that it's not relevant.
I think they're concerned about it not being relevant.
Yeah. And actually you sort of go, no, it's incredibly relevant.
Or not interesting. They don't think they're interesting. Or why would people... do people really want to know about this? Will people really, particularly as you, and one of the things I picked up on earlier is about you were saying, make it as personal as you can.
Yeah.
But there's a bit of a conflict there, I think, for people, because with the exception of a few people, and we know a few between us, who do find themselves very interesting, right? The majority of people don't, or they're nervous of thinking they'll be talking about something that they don't feel the audience will be want to listen to. It's a psychological barrier, I think, gets in the way.
It is. And I think as you go through life, and you, especially if you take life seriously, or you've got a lot of things to be concerned about, your ability to think about story and your sense of what it means diminishes. So you undervalue it. And I think that's the great shame. And a lot of the time, you know, I'm working with people just to exercise this idea of connecting to memory, connecting to story. One of the great exercises in the Storyworthy book, which I think is a great one, it's such a simple one, is when you work with someone, you know, you spark them. So, for example, I might say to you, we'll take 4 elements, which is first, last, best, worst. So I might say to you, okay, let's take a holiday. What's the first holiday that you recall? Mm-hmm. And you might come up with a childhood memory of that holiday and what it meant to you and where it was. What was the last one you just took? So it'll be fresh in your mind where it was. And then best and worst. You can do that with cars. You can do that with a kiss. You can do that with a relationship. You can do that with a pet. The point is you're stimulating the mind to reconnect to story, which is memory often. That can be connected to an experience within the boardroom or any other corporate environment, but you are getting people to connect to it because quite often they forget it.
Are you asking them the question, or are you advocating that? It's like, if I did first, last, best and worst about a topic, that in itself is a piece of communication for them in order to get across a certain point.
Yeah, it's a way of tapping into that thought. It depending on whatever you're looking at. You know, if I said to you, for example, your first ever event that you facilitated, the last one you facilitated, what was the best one you ever facilitated, what was the worst one? You would have stories connected very much to every element of that. Yeah. And so we could pull out learning from that. You will know about your worst ever experience, what you learned. Yeah. That's what we're after.
I could probably spend a good 2 hours answering just those questions, to be honest. We've had a few best and worst between us over the years as well. And what about, you mentioned advertising. If we can take information that we know psychologically works well in one setting, we can apply it in another. You know, one of the best examples is advertising, surely. Yeah. Particularly, I'm talking about engaging people with brands. Yeah. Or engaging the public with a particular brand. Yeah. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, and I think that's where you can really see it, because obviously that's where all the thought has gone into that process. And I certainly think Apple stand out in that, probably before Steve Jobs left us, because he was so focused on the creativity of how the brand was. I think it's different now, but I think of very key moments within that. I remember the Misunderstood Christmas ad they did in 2013, I think, which went on to win an Emmy Award. It's a brilliant example of storytelling. I recommend anyone go and look at it, but if in short form, it's the story of Christmas, of a family who turn up at their grandparents, and the teenage son is on his phone all the way through. So he seems to be distracted, seems to be lost within that environment, which we all recognize in many ways and battle with even more now than 10 years ago. And you watch this ad and you think, oh, he's missing it all. He's missing everything. He's missing every experience. And then it's a 30-second ad. At the end of that ad, he just makes his way through Christmas morning and presses his iPhone and turns the telly on. And he's edited this ad together about their family, that experience. He's put it to a Christmas song. And it's a real tearjerker. You can't help it. It's manipulative brilliantly. And you can see why it won the awards that it won. It's brilliant. And you barely see the phone, but you get a sense of what Apple were about. And that was about the experience. And that's when it's great.
I mean, it reminds me, if you think about what the major benefit of storytelling does in a business environment, or in any environment, is the one thing that it does more best than anything is engage and evoke emotion.
Yeah.
And if you want to get your audience to feel something, if you want to get across a message of, we need to get serious, we need to change, we should be celebrating. Stories evoke emotion. They are a fast track to getting someone into an emotional state. And then once they're in that emotional state, then you can hit them with your product or your message, which is really what great adverts do. I mean, quite often there's very little product placement in these really good ads until right to the end, once you're into the emotional state. It's very, very powerful media.
Yeah.
I think we've probably already, David, alluded to a few of these things, but when we think about the applications of storytelling, maybe we could delve a little bit into some of these. The most obvious one that you and I are often work together on is helping organizations differentiate themselves in a pitching environment, particularly if they're in a competitive bid running often to multi-millions, long-term, multi-year contracts, where the differentiation in product, technical detail, specification, claims you can make about your product or your service, they're marginally different.
Yeah.
You get your top two or three, leaders in a market, and the differentiation isn't that great. So this is where storytelling can really make a difference. But often to the people doing the work, their natural disposition is to talk about those technical aspects.
Yeah.
Rather than thinking about how do we build a compelling narrative for the client to understand how they can help them. So could you maybe just talk a little bit about, I know you do quite a bit of work in this, so do I as well, so we could talk a little bit about that. How can we bring, and what should people do to bring storytelling into this sort of pitching environment?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's quite often especially when you sit down with someone and like you say, in the pitch environment, and you might say, why you? If I look in this particular sector, there's 4 of you in there. What's the reason that I'm going to say yes to you? And I'm always amazed at how stuck people are. They'll say, we put the customer first, and all these sort of stock answers. And the one thing they don't do is produce a story that highlights why they do what they do and the way that they do what they do, and why we would trust them. And that can only be through story. I mean, as an actor, I remember working in Selfridges. So this is probably over now 40 years ago, and Selfridges changed their policy in around the mid 1980s, I think.
Was this to supplement your acting income?
Absolutely.
So you were working in Selfridges as an actor?
In Selfridges. I had a lovely job, which was with, at the time, the height of, you'll remember this, we're similar ages, when everybody wanted a Mont Blanc or they wanted a Waterman pen. So I worked in that particular sector.
Okay.
And Selfridges said that we're going to change our policy now. Whatever anyone comes in, they can get a full refund. Our customer service now has to be absolutely the best. And I remember this one occasion, and I tell this story time and time again, because for me, the impact of this was fantastic. I was once on the pen department, and a smallish lady, later in her years, probably in her late 70s, came in quite slowly and came up to the pen department and placed this jumper with the receipt and said, I don't like this, I'd like a refund. And I remember the manageress at the time getting this lady a seat and said, yes, no, that's no problem whatsoever, and went away. And she was away for quite some time. This lady was sitting down and people were chatting to her. About 15, 20 minutes later, she returns. She gives this lady this cash refund, and she leaves. I later found out that the actual jumper this woman had bought came from M&S next door, and she had popped over, got a refund, came back, and not even told her. And I thought, that is customer service. Wow. That is going the extra mile. And she didn't even, shout about it. And I tell that story a lot because it really had an impact on me. And I think it's knowing what you do, which is outstanding. And then you can tell the story. If it's a genuine story, you can tell that story. And we step back and go, wow, well, obviously the culture worked, the way it is, what you do. And then trust builds and you go, well, I want to work with that company. So I think often it's just finding those intrinsic stories within your organization which highlight who you are. As long as that culture matches, then those stories are everywhere.
Yeah. Well, you can imagine the complete opposite of that.
Oh, well, often, yeah.
You know, and sort of think, well, you know, almost like a rude response. What are you doing here? You didn't buy this here. You know,
Absolutely.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's a great example, and it's that happened many years ago, and it's stuck with you for many years. So yeah,
and quite often, if I work with people in terms of looking at actually improving their customer service in this country, time and time again, John Lewis will come up as how somebody went the extra mile to actually do something great. And I think that says a lot about that culture.
Yeah, I would agree. I know in my own experience, when it comes to business pitches, people are very good at laying out, you know, hopefully if they've done their homework, they can express back to the client what their understanding of the situation is, what the need is, what it might look like if they've solved that problem, how their product might fit that. But sometimes it still lacks emotion. It's like a sort of chronological playback of all the facts. And the challenge is that if you've got competitors going in, you know, often sometimes a beauty parade type situation, maybe 4 or 5 over the course of 2 or 3 days, you're not really sounding that different. So where does somebody really start in trying to think about, okay, how can we take this information we've got and just make it sound more interesting, create some emotion such that when they're thinking back to these various potential suppliers, we stand out in their minds? Where do people start with that?
Well, I often start with, when you look at a pitch, you start with what's the ideal? What's the ideal for the client? What is their ideal? And that sparks off all this idea of where they really want to get to, why they haven't got there, and what is it? What's this idea of what it is? So I start with the ideal. I then ask them and say, okay, what's the reality? Where are they right now? What is happening today? What is the status quo?
Yeah.
And from that, I say, okay, so that's where they are today. So what gets in the way? What's the problem that actually, or the challenge that is in the way of them reaching this ideal? And then they talk about whatever it is, a shrinking market, whatever it might be. We explore all of that. And then you play with, okay, so what's your solution for them? What are the solutions that you've got? Then they delve into that. So you're giving them steps they understand. From that, it's much, much easier to build this journey and to say, okay, if that's the ideal, what are those steps? What are those steps to get to that ideal? Is this 6 months? Is this 6 years? But what's the journey they go on? Now that we've looked at it and explored it, it gives people a framework. It's like any story. It's any story. You must start with what's the ideal and what's the difference between that and the reality that you have today and what's getting in the way. That's for all of us. You know, I'd like to be lighter. You know, that's my ideal. I'd like to be 2 stone lighter. The reality is I'm still eating Mars bars. So that's the problem but that's what gets in the way. Yeah. That's what gets in the way. So I think it's getting people to define it and understand it. And from that, all sorts of ideas come up. I mean, one of the big things I often do with people when we're looking at pitching is, look, I want you to consider that the client's in the room. They're listening to everything that you're saying. Get an empty chair, have that empty chair, the client's there all the time. It's really fascinating in terms of how they change what they do and what they're thinking about
when they start talking about it.
Absolutely. It's a massive difference. They're in the room. They're listening to the process you're going through.
In building the pitch.
And it's fascinating.
Well, that's interesting. I guess that forces them to come out of, I've got to prepare this presentation, to having a real meaningful conversation you actually want the client to really hear. Yeah. Rather than this sort of polished, beautifully curated presentation that leaves people feeling a little bit...
Completely. Oh, we'll do that. We'll do this. We'll do that on the day and we'll do that. Well, would your client want to hear that? Yeah. Don't worry about that. We'll do that in a taxi on the way there.
Yeah. You kind of mentioned this, I think, a bit earlier when we were talking, but if you don't think these things through properly or rehearse them, I know myself as a presenter that every story I'm about to tell sounds amazing in my head. I mean, I'm laughing my head off. I'm chuckling away to myself. I've got images of them responding. That just doesn't always play itself out.
Yeah.
So practicing these things, and I like that. It makes it very real, keeps it very, very real and very authentic. So I like that concept. So the kind of story arc, I guess there's lots of different story arcs. And you were kind of describing a story arc there. I often think also a good place to start in any story is, and you kind of alluded to here, is what is the change in the world that is causing, why are we even having this conversation today? What prompted us? What were the things that happened that have led to this event today, where we're now having a conversation about you potentially buying a service or a product from us? Got to be something that happened. Something that prompted it.
Absolutely.
And if you start in that place, that is the beginning of the story.
Yeah, completely.
These are the steps that led us here. And they could be playing back, could be asking questions, but quite often they are prompts from the outside world that has caused them to think, well, we need to do something different. We know right now everyone's in a state of slight confusion about what does generative AI really mean for our business.
Absolutely.
Hopefully you're making use of generative AI. I hear this all the time. In fact, I was speaking to someone on a train yesterday who is in this area. And I said, what are people really referring to? I mean, I know about ChatGPT, but what actually is this thing? What would I be using it for? And she was able to give me some stories and sort of anecdotes about where they're using it. But I do think, so if you're talking about that, again, people, because there's a lack of meaning and understanding, and it's not necessarily highly referenceable for people, when you're pitching a new concept or a new idea, stories are invaluable because they enable people to land in a world that are unfamiliar with. They know they need to change, but they're not sure, they've got these prompts or triggers, but they're not quite sure where they're going to end up or what the so-called promised land's going to look like, your ideal. So stories are great for that. And that's what I'm really alluding to here is how does somebody take somebody from a list of logical facts and figures and numbers, and the clients ask you to talk about these 5 things. It's up to us to build it into a compelling narrative.
And I also think more so now than ever before, because what AI is giving us is these tools to make everything really sound great, look great. But what they lack is the soul and the emotion of what the reason is behind it. At the moment, I can read stuff that has come out of ChatGPT, that has gone into ChatGPT and has come back out, and I read it and I go, yeah, this is great, but I know it's AI. Soon I won't. But the one thing that will really resonate with me is authenticity, the truth of it, the soul of the piece, and that's going to become more and more important. I've just been looking at this latest AI, I think, what's it called? I can't remember the name of it, Sora. Anyway, Microsoft's video AI. It is phenomenal in terms of giving it a prompt and what you get back. We soon will not be able to tell reality, but we will get whether it has soul or not. And at the moment, I mean, who knows how time will change, but we can spot if it doesn't have soul. It's the one thing that makes us human. It's that, all the things that we go through in our life is what build up that picture of, because our experiences are very similar. So we get it. We know loss, we know pain, we know joy. All those elements need to be in, if we're talking about a corporate story, whether it's pitching, whether it's in the boardroom, whether it's, in front of the entire organization. If we resonate with soul and emotion to what that story is, then it will work and we will recall it.
And I guess back to your earlier point is, ChatGPT is not going to know your personal story. They're referencing.
Yeah.
They are referencing stories.
It may well in the future, but
they may
right now,
right now. But to be able to articulate something that has meant something to you, that you can recount to a client, that experience has, is able to, evoke emotion, but deliver a key message. That is far more powerful than, a beautifully articulated, and that's what it's incredibly good at, is being able to take messages, simplify them, articulate them in a shorter form.
Yeah.
to carry a lot more impact. But it's just no substitute for, I don't think, your own personal referenceable experience and story and what it's meant to you personally, and then why that is relevant to the client.
Yeah.
But also, as you say, as a leader, if we turn our attention to business leaders, again, we both do a lot of work with business leaders. Quite often the CEOs of businesses who have to use story, or should be using storytelling at least, to convey a message. Mm-hmm. There was a gentleman yesterday I was speaking to, and he'd been made the CEO a couple of years ago. He'd been there 25 years, a very proud moment for him. He was talking to me and how he tells stories about how their product, which is a kind of, I can understand it was like an air purifier that is used in sort of laboratory conditions.
Yeah.
And where pharmaceutical tablets and mixing molecules and et cetera, needs to be in a very pure environment. And it was showing the translation between how their product enables the manufacture of these life-saving pharmaceuticals. And that's the story he tells. And he has substantially increased this kind of manufacturing company employees' engagement because they're now much more connected to not what just manufacturing widgets, but what their actual product does for people.
Yeah, yeah.
And he said to me, I'm always looking for stories.
Yeah.
I'm telling the same message, but I'm using different stories all the time.
Yeah. And that I think, we're going back to the beginning of this discussion, is that it's very important that you get these stories down. Don't let one go by, because you are going to forget it for sure.
You will forget it. Like a joke. You think that's a great joke? I'm going to tell that joke to somebody. Yeah. I'm going to tell that joke. Oh, that's a great joke.
Yeah.
10 days later, you can't remember the start of it. No. And you certainly can't remember the punchline. No. Right? So absolutely don't rely on your memory. Write them down. I completely agree with that. I think the challenge for many leaders, they're often tasked with having to paint a picture of the future. They're quite often only them at this point, and maybe a small cluster of other leaders, really believe in. Mm-hmm. And then trying to sell that story purely on enthusiasm and belief isn't necessarily going to be enough. So borrowing stories and anecdotes from the past is very powerful. And that's what you call them metaphors, anecdotes, stories, whatever. Yeah. But using, so for example, if you were talking about the art of the possible, we've had probably one of the best examples ever in the history of the world in 2020, where at that time, particularly in terms of the corporate world, and around that time, and maybe a couple of years before, organisations were trying to organise themselves around moving to hybrid working. And most of these organisations, and this is well documented, had plans to move maybe 30,000 of their 100,000 workforce to a hybrid working setup within a 2-year period. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the plan that was seen quite reasonable to do. But as we all know, that literally happened in 4 weeks, in 6 weeks. So when we think about things, if I was a leader, I'd be capitalizing on stories like that to get across a certain point around the art of the possible. Yeah, that's the sort of thing that would encourage you to. I mean, if it was around change, use a story of change. If it was a story of hope, inspiration. Think about what from the past that people can identify with and know to be true, and then link that to your own situation. And maybe then you can diminish, not completely, but start to diminish, not eliminate, those feelings of cynicism that often come with sort of leadership visionary type stories. Mm-hmm. So, because that's the art, isn't it? The art of pitching, the art of winning over your employees or to attract people is to be able to sell them a vision.
Absolutely.
And, the visions are things that haven't happened yet. So
absolutely.
That's the really key thing. So do tap into that and I'm always encouraging leaders to do that. How can I do this? Well, where's a good story? One you believe in, one you're excited about, one that you know about to be true. Just one thing we haven't touched on is that when it comes to telling stories, we use, as you well know, the kind of analogy of the singer-songwriter, the playwright, actor, the presentation, the story, presenter, in that you've got to have good content, that is the songwriter, the playwright, the presentation builder. You then have to have a good singer to perform that song, or a good actor or a good presenter. So it's both being able to be good at both. And we're mainly focusing on here and in the curation of the story. But then, as you'll know from your acting training and my work in presenting, you have to be you need to work on being able to be a good storyteller. Does that resonate with you? I know we share a similar view on this.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest areas once you're working with somebody on story that at some point they have to tell that story. It may be to thousands of people. And then that process is combining all of those elements, how well they command their space, whether they project their energy and their voice to an audience, whether they feel or we feel that they are confident and happy in that space. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've got to combine all of those things. I think it's a given. You are at some point delivering or performing that story, and you have to take all of those elements in. It's the completeness of anything. And when you look at, you may have someone with a great story, especially when you're looking at a TED event, you've got to make sure they can tell that story and they know how to share it with an audience and they're okay with sharing it, because that's the last big hurdle. Because if they can't, and if you say any one of those elements is missing, like if it's a bad singer of a great song, it's not going to land.
So the performance does become an element to it, but that can be worked on.
Yeah.
And you get the right coaching. Often, as we said, we alluded to earlier, it's often about giving yourself like psychological permission to step into that place, to perform, to be there, know that you're sharing something of which is worthwhile to the audience, and get past your own limiting beliefs.
I think that's it. I think the key thing is getting people to believe that you are sharing something of value, and it takes them out of the picture. It helps them to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as a sort of an example, that business storytelling has its place when it makes a valuable point about something. And stories that get a bad rap is when someone's rambling on about something and you haven't got a Scooby-Doo where it's going, what the point of it is, and you're left at the end also with that thought. Now, that is irritating. That doesn't equal stories don't work. That equals someone doesn't know how to tell a good business story. So there is a sort of a flow to it. And I'll just give a quick example. One of the models that we use up front when we start off a program to help people kind of orientate themselves to getting the maximum from invested time in a training event. We talk about these three factors: focus, openness, and energy. Focus, openness, and energy. Your focus, be there, and I talk about this whole thing around, you're physically in the room, now you've got to mentally be in the room. And one of the elements of that is, of course, the distraction of your phone. And, I call it the black hole of death, sitting there and it's beckoning you in, and you've been watching, you haven't touched it, you haven't felt it, and you want to be drawn into it. And of course, once you dive into that black hole, you're not taking any notice of the facilitator or what's going on in the room. You're distracted by what's going back into your world whence you've come from. And then I talk a little bit about openness, being open to people's ideas beyond what you already know about. And we talk about energy, the importance of physicality in the room, sitting upright, bringing energy, contributing, etc. Anyway, embellish all these three things. Yeah. And that's keeping a long story short here. And anyway, I went to this event, and I was in Washington, D.C. There was probably about 250 senior managers, quite a big event. And I was told by the organisers that at some point, the CEO of this 2 billion global operation is going to turn up and would like to share some thoughts with the audience. Not quite sure where they're going to turn up. It'll be on a tight schedule. Would you mind if we gave you a signal from the back of the room that you could sort of close down what you were saying, enter the CEO, he does his thing, and I return to the stage? Absolutely no problem. So, that duly arrived, and the time arrived, and got the nod and exited the stage. CEO enters the stage, starts speaking. I'm sitting there listening. And I'm in the US, I live in the UK. I think just obviously we're behind the US, so I think I'll just check, see how the day's been going. It's like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I'm looking at my phone. I'm thinking, oh no, I don't believe this. Oh, this hasn't been sent. This hasn't been done. There's a bit of a disaster, a problem with a client. And I'm like tapping away on my phone, trying to sort this out. Suddenly, I just became conscious of my name being spoken. And what I could hear was the CEO saying, if Martin was actually listening to me, he would know how to answer the question. That suddenly jolted me out of my unconscious focus on my phone. I then have 250 faces looking at me, smiling, smirking. Of course, the CEO doesn't know about this previous story I've told. I've literally been caught red-handed, literally with my trousers down, so to speak, right? Literally, trying to splutter out a few words and going crimson at the same time. Made a little bit of a joke. And he was being quite light with me, by the way. He wasn't being overly serious, but there was a little bit of exchange between us. But at some point, I've now got returned to the stage, and I thought, right, yeah, I kind of need to explain myself here, So I go on the stage, and they're leaders, right? So I thought, well, I need to utilise this. And, I sort of apologised and made a little slight light of it. And I said, look, isn't this a classic case of walking your talk, saying one thing to one person, but actually doing the complete opposite? I explained how I got caught up using my phone, going back, thinking about, I said, it's so easily done. So maybe there's certainly a lesson for me there. But let me put this to you, where have you done exactly the same thing? Where have you espoused some virtue or some value only to find that you're actually not living to those values or acting inconsistent with that? So yes, there's a big learning point for me here, but I think it's a learning point for all of us. Next time you find yourself in a situation where you're espousing a certain point, be absolutely sure to, live true to that thing and notice that as a leader, you're on 24/7. Yeah. There's no time off. You can't say I was having a bad day.
And also that's a great example of how those moments, which can be considered to be moments of failure in one respect, are our greatest stories.
Indeed, our greatest gift. Absolutely.
Always.
Yeah.
Maybe not at the moment that it happens, but...
Yeah. Oh, it was fun. But if I'm recounting that story now, and I do use that example, it follows an arc. It definitely follows an arc, and it's not too similar to what you talked about earlier. You put people in the picture. So the first thing to do is to bring, like any film does, they show you, demonstrate, here are the various characters. So you put people in the picture. I'm in a room. We've got these 250 leaders. I'm on a stage. You're explaining the context.
Yeah.
Right. Then, generally, like in any film, drama, story, something goes wrong, right? And it's that incident, that difficulty, that problem. And overcoming that problem is what makes the story worthwhile, because it leads you somewhere.
Yeah.
And I talked about how I overcame that, what the result of that was. Here's the problem. This was the result. A few funnies in there. I've slightly embellished the story, as you can well imagine, over the years.
Never.
Never. But there has to be some sort of learning point.
Yeah.
Right? But quite often the mistake I think that leaders make is they just finish it there.
Yeah.
They just go, there's the learning point. But the learning point for whom?
Yeah.
What you want to do is make the learning point for the audience. So the final bit is then to say, well, how does this apply to you? What would you do next time when you're in that situation? Or it's with this thought, I challenge each of you to X, Y, Z, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So it's not just about you. It's not just about the learning point, but it's also about where they can apply in the future.
Yeah.
So simple framework. And as always, we'll put these ideas and these framework in a little takeaway for people so they can follow this and use it. Because they're very simple tools.
Absolutely.
That you can use immediately that will help you craft stories that really do resonate and make a difference with your audience. David, do you have any sort of final examples or tips or things that people can use, practical things that people can use?
Certainly things that we've mentioned over this talk, which I think are certainly worth taking away and think about how you're going to stretch that muscle in terms of story and how to make sure that you're beginning to observe story. I've recently flown back from Luxembourg and I'm amazed when I sit in the airport lounge, 99% of people are just aimlessly scrolling. When you ask them to spend 5 or 10 minutes a day just to write down the stories of their day, they go, seems like a lot. But I observe people wasting hours of time just scrolling. So a few key things I think takeaways in terms of to help you get to where you want to get. One is I absolutely recommend, however you're going to do it, find your story of the day, whether you're going to put it into a notebook or, we use these digital books, or whether it's an Excel spreadsheet, find a way of getting things down. That's a great one. The little exercise I talked to you about, which I think is brilliant, this first, last, best, worst. It doesn't matter what you're looking at, look at it in that respect. What was the first? What was the last one? What was the best? What was the worst? That's a great way of stimulating story. That's a great one. I think just a simple template of what's the ideal, what's the reality today, what are the problems, the challenges, what's the solution, what's the next step? That's a quick way to get to story. It's a quick way to dig into it and go, okay, I can frame it around this. And, we know in terms of if you can actually get your story initially down to 30 seconds, then you know you've got your story, and then you can build out from that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah. Look, I too would massively encourage people to, whenever you do a presentation, whenever you're tasked with, no matter how long or short it is, get into the discipline of thinking, where can I put a story into this? And recognize that I guarantee to you that when people are remarking or recalling your presentation, it's the story of the headless giraffe that they're going to remember. All right, you tripping on some stairs, something that went wrong,
Yeah.
story about your auntie, an emotional story about your mother, or whatever it might be. That's what they're going to remember. Long after all the facts and figures that you've delivered. And as you've alluded to many times, it's the human connection that we are humans, and we love to connect with other humans, and we connect with them in an emotional way, which is why films and books and dramas are so popular and continue to be forever. So utilize this basic human psychology for communication and persuasion and influence. It's so powerful. It really, you don't have to be some master orator, storyteller, communicator, actor in order to be able to do it. In fact, a bit of vulnerability when you're telling the story is actually, can even be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you have a framework, that is the key thing, is to have a meaning and a purpose to the various different stages in which you're telling that story, and using the frameworks David has talked about. That is what is going to help you go from a meandering, waffling, kind of slightly dull, boring, what the hell are you talking about, to, wow, this is really captivating, interesting and relevant.
And often anecdote to story.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
That's the thing, is you're finding the story.
Yeah. So have fun with this, enjoy it. And thank you, David, for this very enlightening conversation.
My pleasure.
Okay. And as always, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, there's some great ideas in here for you, do share it with other people. It's through sharing we're helping other people learn. People are always looking for ideas, particularly around communication. So share it with other people and you'll be doing them a big favour. Any comments or any further information you'd like on this subject, please drop us a note and we'll be happy to expand on these ideas and maybe revisit this subject once again in a further podcast. Until next time, thank you very much.